hey, good morning. Listen, Ditz and I could have told you that this was the introverted crowd, and that's the extroverted crowd at the 9:30. Everything goes better at the 9:30. Either that, or the 9:30 people just don't care. Like, they have no care for their, how everybody thinks of them, how, the opinions of others, anything like that. You guys are a little bit more reserved in that capacity. So I'm glad you're here, whether you're the 9:30 crowd or the 11 o'clock crowd or whatever that looks like. So you're like, man, do pastors really think about us that way? Yeah, we do. We're constantly thinking about you guys. So, okay, that maybe didn't come across the way I wanted it to, but okay, whatever. I have an announcement for you this morning. So to piggyback off some of the other things that have been said, we have a student event coming up this Sunday night. So not tonight, but next Sunday night, the 9th of November, from 6 to 8:30. This will be over at the Kelso's house. And the Kelso's have passionately pleaded with me that that's actually treetops, though I think it's actually Thornwild. And so, where it's not. Okay, whatever. Because Thornwild Elementary is literally in your backyard, and yet you're telling me you're in treetops. It doesn't make any sense. But that's where it's going to happen. It's going to be a fun night for the students. If you're a student in the room, you'll want to be there. So they're going to have pizza, and then they're going to make s'mores. They're going to have lawn games, which I actually personally question lawn games at 6 p.m. because I don't know how, light and... I don't trust teenagers in the light with lawn games, so I don't know how it's going to work in the dark, but we'll have you sign a waiver or something, it'll be fine. So 6 to 8:30, s'mores, pizza, it'll be a fun night. Parents, encourage you. We're trying to ramp up some of our student ministry stuff here at our campus, and so this will be a great opportunity to kind of get your kids connected. And then the football game's going to be on the big screen as well. Parents, we need your help. If you could potentially help supply some of the graham crackers and chocolate, marshmallows, and some sticks to roast, that would be awesome. And if you are willing and able to do that, you can see Jamie, who I believe is in this room right now. There she is. She's over there. Okay. And so see her afterwards, and she'll be happy to connect you with that. We are in a teaching series called Grace Marriage, and it's been a fun series to go through. Last week, we talked to the husbands and to the future husbands and to the men. And so this week, we're going to kind of turn our attention and talk to the wives, future wives, and women in general. And so here's how I want to enter the discussion here this morning. Ladies, your role as a wife carries a tremendous amount of power. And I have noticed this in the case of my marriage for several years, but my wife demonstrated this freshly this week. And I'm really glad that she did. So something happened this week. Something occurred, and I got mad. Wasn't something that Colleen was involved in at all, but I got mad. And when I heard it, it was in the evening. Colleen and I were the only ones in the house, and I got mad. And more accurately to say, I wasn't just mad, I was enraged. And the way to say that is my eyes were bulging out, my face was red, and I was talking at a really loud volume. Some of you think that's probably not possible, but it's most definitely possible. Now, Colleen has some experience in handling this situation, and so she came over to me, she looked at me with a smile, she listened as I was yelling, and she listened for a couple seconds, decided that I was not going to be in a place where there was a discussion that was going to happen this evening, and so she politely just walked away as I continued to talk. I was fired up. So the next morning, when I had calmed down and was thinking logically and rationally about the situation, I knew what I needed to do is I had to go to this person. And so I went to this person and I talked the issue through and actually handled it well from that morning forward, and for which God gets the credit, because if you would know me well, you know that wouldn't necessarily have always been my practice in my life. And so I called Colleen afterwards and I told her, hey, here's what happened, here's what I did. And then I also told her, I said, hey, how I acted last night was wrong. And I actually got more specific and I said, this is specifically what I did wrong last night. And she was really gracious in that moment, but also clearly affirming and agreeing that I was wrong. And then she started in with some encouragement. She told me that I had handled the situation really well and that I've actually grown in this. And then we talked about some good next steps for me in handling the moment differently when it happens like there immediately. It was such a really good conversation. And then she said that she wanted to circle back to something that was said at the marriage conference. And so this happened midweek, and so we had a marriage conference at our Mount Zion location last Friday and Saturday. And she said she wanted to circle back to something that was said at the marriage conference. One of the speakers talked about how people can say really hurtful things at certain moments. And the speaker gave an illustration of a person saying to another person, "You will never amount to anything in life." That's a really hurtful statement to make. That statement hit home to me in the moment that the speaker said that. And my wife knew it. She didn't have to look at me. We didn't have to have a conversation about it. She knew that it hit home with me. You see, my dad, who I knew loved me very much and still loves me very much, and he has said some things in my life that have been really encouraging. But he would say those exact words to me as a kid when I would screw up. And I screwed up a lot as a kid. And so his face would get red, and his stocky, muscular frame would explode toward me with those words, "You will never amount to anything." And when he said those things, those words hurt. And in a moment when I knew that I had screwed up this past week, not only did Colleen bring those words up to me, but she brought them up and she said, "Just so you know, you have amounted to a great deal." Ladies, I want to tell you, the power of her words, the power of her role as a wife in that moment were clearly on display. Not only did she lift me up spiritually, not only did she lift me up emotionally, but just physically, I felt lighter from the weight of having to navigate life and some of the challenges and some of the screw-ups that I make. Because, so you know, ladies, your husbands know oftentimes when they screw up. They sometimes just don't volunteer that information. And so when you can speak words of encouragement and life into them in their vulnerable moments, you are unleashing the power that God has given to you in marriage. And so today, my goal is for you to be able to see the power that God has given to you and how to use it in your life and in your marriage so that God gets the glory and so that your husband and you grow together and you both follow Jesus. And so if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. This is a passage that we looked at last week. We read the entirety of the passage last week, Ephesians 5, 21 to 33. We focused on verses 25 to 33. And so this week, we're going to focus on verses 21 to 24, but we'll also pick up with verse 33 because 33 has something to say for both men and for women. And so Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 33, here's what Paul records for us. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And this is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So this morning, as we talk to the ladies and the wives and the future wives in the room, I want to talk to you about two specific words that the text raises that are very important to your role as a wife. Those two words are submission and respect. Submission and respect. Now, in verse 22, there is the command, wives, submit to your husbands. Before we get there, though, I want to point out that that's put against the backdrop of verse 21. Verse 21 tells us that submission itself is something that everybody does. If we are going to live the way God wants us to live in the body of Christ within our community, we actually need to recognize that submission is something we all do. Verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so we find the command for wives here to submit to their husbands in the context of submission for everyone. And so this verse 21 reminds us of a simple truth, that it's not just women that submit to men, wives to husbands, but this actually goes across the spectrum. And yes, there will be the women that will submit to men, but there will also be men that will submit to men, and there will also be men that will submit to women, and that all this is meant to happen in the body of Christ functioning the way that it is supposed to function. And too many times, this submission focus of the wives gets abused, and primarily it gets abused into all women everywhere must submit to all men everywhere. But verse 21 clearly points out that that is not what is happening here at all. It clearly shows that all men will need to submit, all women will need to submit. It's something that we all will have to do at various parts in our lives. And yet, verse 22 tells us, wives, submit to your husbands. Very clearly stating, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. Now, at least it was the case in the first service, it's probably the case in the second service, that the word submit brings about a certain amount of tension. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And partly, I think, because our culture uses the word submit in kind of toxic and cultural ways that are not the way in which the scripture presents it. But I think it would be helpful to explain what submission is and what submission is not. Submission itself is this kind of strategic, yielding posture within the marriage relationship for the flourishing of the marriage and for the flourishing of the husband and wife. Fundamentally, that is what submission is. Now, here's what submission is not. Submission is not a command based on competence or talent. Sometimes, some people who generally speaking are arrogant and proud will say that this passage means that all men are better leaders than women. Of course, this passage doesn't actually say that. It's somebody just twisting it. It's very possible within a marriage relationship for the husband to actually be gifted in leadership and to be gifted in leadership in a way that the wife is not. Totally possible. What is also totally possible is that the wife could be gifted in leadership in ways that the husband is not. Either one of those could be true, and it does not affect in any way, shape, or form God's design for marriage and the roles that we play in the marriage relationship. Because God doesn't give us the responsibilities that He gives us as husbands and wives based on gifting or talent. He gives it based on the way He has designed marriage to work. And so He has something greater going on. Now, because this is a posture, because submission itself is kind of this yielding strategic posture, As a wife, this should give you the freedom that comes with being able to share your thoughts and your insights and your knowledge and your experience within the marriage relationship to your husband, knowing that your husband is ultimately responsible before God for your marriage. And smart husbands capitalize on the giftedness and expertise of their wives in that moment so that they can actually bring the best idea and solution to the table. Poor leadership happens when the husband thinks his opinion is always the best. He never prays it through, and he never listens to the counsel of his wife. Because after all, he's the head of the household, so that means he automatically is right about everything. That's actually a radical authoritarian culture that doesn't do well. I can tell you this, it will not do well in your marriage. So anybody who's trying to apply that, you will apply that for about a week and a half, and that's not going to work anymore. It's a poor interpretation of the text. It's never what God intended. Let's pull this out of the marriage relationship a second. Let's just pull this back even into our working worlds and the places that you are at the present moment. If you're in a leadership position and people appreciate you in your leadership position, it is probably because you recognize that your role as a leader isn't to simply forward your own ideas, it's to get a lay of the land and understand all of the ideas and make sure that the best ideas make their way forward into implementation. And leaders who do that well in the corporate world, in the business world, are leaders that people like to work for. Leaders who believe their ideas are the only ideas and their ideas are the best ideas, those are people that people do not want to work for. And you know it. I mean, I could probably hand the microphone over to you and you could share story after story, positive and probably mostly negative, of people who have led in poor ways and in good ways. So again, I bring this back into the marriage relationship and would simply say this: wives, that your yielding and that strategic yielding that you have going on, if your husband leads well, it's going to really meld well. And so that husband will say, hey, you know what? I don't have the best idea here. My wife's got the best idea. Let's make sure this gets forwarded and make sure this gets implemented for the flourishing of our marriage. And that is kind of the dynamic that we see in existence. A wife in that strategic yielding can do wonders. Now, I'll say this, and this is important to point out. Wives, you can be in a posture of this kind of strategic yielding, this submission, and still push back on your husband's ideas and viewpoints. I don't know if you needed, you're like, hey, this is coming in handy later on. I'm going to bring this back up. You can totally do that. A wise husband who is leading well will welcome that feedback, will welcome that pushback. I would say the same thing again about leadership that you have met in the corporate or business world. The best leaders don't mind being challenged because their ideas get better, and everyone wins when that happens. And so the same thing in a marriage relationship. Guys, if your wife is providing insightful feedback that might occasionally challenge some of your ideas, you should welcome that. What's happening there is she is potentially helping you make better choices. At the same time, if you as a wife find yourself constantly disagreeing with your husband, and he really is showing evidence of trying to lead well and to lead humbly, you may want to check yourself because there's quite a good likelihood that you do not have the strategic yielding posture. You're just simply refusing to submit. And if you're constantly disagreeable and when your husband is really trying to lead well, that's something that you have to check yourself with. Now, I'm going to give a couple more little side things here that I think are helpful. Some of you in the room may have a husband who is currently demonstrating poor leadership, and it's really obvious that they're demonstrating poor leadership. I'm not talking about like your husband on Wednesday of this past week really he just dropped the ball, and he would agree that he dropped the ball. But for the most part, he does a pretty good job. That's not all I'm talking about. I'm not talking anything close to that. I'm talking about a husband who has consistently developed this poor leadership. He's arrogant. He refuses to listen. He doesn't do what's in the best interest of the family on a regular basis. And anybody that spent any time with him would come to the same conclusion. All right? That's the type of poor leadership that I'm talking about. And the challenge for you in that moment is to submit even though he's not acting wisely. Even though he's making financial choices that are poor and spiritual choices that are poor and work choices that are poor and relational choices that are poor. And whatever that looks like, it is important for you to try to share with him your thoughts, to try to help him see another way, but to do so in a respectful way. And I would say before you do that, you should spend some time praying for an opportunity where he will listen and praying for wisdom in that moment as you share that. But ultimately, as long as it's not a serious sin issue, you might choose to submit even though the decision or the direction he is making is going to lead to some heartache or pain in the family. If you do that in the moment, I want to kind of point out something just to be helpful here. This is kind of two sides of the same coin. You should recognize that you're not the only voice that's speaking into your husband's life at that moment. You're an important voice for sure, but you're not the only voice that's speaking into your husband's life at that moment. You see, men, when we are the leaders in the home, we are accountable for what happens in the home and for the decisions that are made in the home and for the direction in the home. I think I didn't point this out last week. I probably should have when I talked to the men and said, hey, you're the leaders in the household. That being the leader in the household doesn't mean, well, okay, that means we get to do whatever I want to do and there's no accountability whatsoever. It's actually the exact opposite. Because more often than not, you are to lead sacrificially and you are totally accountable. And so, ladies, I want to encourage you this way, that if you choose to submit in those moments where your husband is leading in a poor way, that are not serious sin issues, that God will work on him. That God is speaking into his life. Now, he may not be paying attention at that moment, but you're not the only one that's speaking into his life. God will deal with poor leadership. Now, I said before, if it isn't a serious sin issue, you may choose to kind of submit and yield. If it is a serious sin issue, you need to be as respectful as possible, but you may well at that moment not choose to participate in that decision or choice or that way. And there's a whole array of situations that we could get into that I'm not going to get into, but I do want to point out one specific thing by way of illustration. If you are in a marriage relationship in which your husband is physically abusive to you and to your children, not just that it happened once and he confessed it and he's not done it again, but I'm talking about a consistent behavior that he is unwilling to repent of, then you need to remove yourself from that situation temporarily. That means separation. Then you do that. You get yourself and you get your children out of the physical abuse. There are too many times that in this radical authoritarian interpretation of a passage like this, people will say, well, I'm just going to stay in the marriage relationship because the person is physically abusive and I'm just going to stay here and I'm not going to say anything. That is just not the case. That is not what is being mentioned here. And you separate with the view of being able to get reconciled back together again, but the behavior has to be addressed. The sin has to be dealt with. And if you're in that situation, if you're in a situation in your moment where there is a husband who is physically abusive to you and to your children, talk to Mike or myself or Ditson afterwards. We want to try to get you some help. Because that's a serious situation. And that is not something you just simply, I'm just going to submit and I'm just going to just take it. That is not what God desires. Now, practically speaking, The dynamic that exists here within the husband and wife relationship, within the strategic yielding relationship, is going to find that you're going to have some give and take in both ways. A good husband delegates responsibility to his wife, which will inevitably result in him needing to submit as well. Like, in a weird way, the husband delegates responsibility to his wife, the wife then delegates responsibility to the husband, and the husband has to submit to the wife. Let me practically how this works. This is the way it works in our household. Doesn't mean it has to work this way in yours, but Colleen has the responsibility of organizing and leading and providing for the meals in our house. So let's say she asks me to run to the store and grab some food from a list that she has created. A wise husband would do what she asks, since he has delegated her the responsibility and she is delegating that responsibility to him. I can go, hey, you know what? I'm the head of the household. Send Jamie. I can do that. It would not be wise. A good husband would not do that. A smart husband would not do that. My point here is that husbands will need to yield to their wives, and this helps the family run well, which again is the whole goal of this submission thing, the strategic yielding for the flourishing and functioning of the family. I really enjoy living in Hebron. I've told you that many times. It's got so many awesome things. You know, you're kind of suburban, but you're still country. It's just kind of a perfect mix. One of the things that I've really enjoyed, it's kind of this idiosyncrasy of Hebron, is that there will be occasions when the red lights on 237 go out for what I can never really discern for a reason. Like, it doesn't seem to rhyme or reason. Like, there's power in the community, there's power in the businesses, but the red lights don't work. Have you anybody ever seen that, experienced that? Okay. So when you see that happen, all you can imagine is you're like, oh man, this is just going to be one huge wreck, right? This is going to be it's a 50-car pile up somewhere between 237 and turning on to 275. It's just not going to work. But the times when this has happened, and I've actually driven over 275 during the times when there's no red light, what you find is something very fascinating. The drivers have actually figured out how to navigate the situation. They've actually figured out who goes next and who doesn't. And really, each driver yields to other drivers. Not because they are an inferior driver, not because they don't have rights, not because they aren't important, not because their opinion doesn't matter, but because they know that in yielding, it brings order and flow to the intersection. And I think that is a brilliant way to describe what God is calling in terms of submission in the marriage relationship. It's why it's so important. If you've got two people leading in the opposite directions, you can't ever go anywhere. There's no function, there's no flow. And so there has to be the give and the take in the marriage relationship for it to work well. I want to point out something additional as well. We think about Jesus himself. And if you look in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see that Jesus plays multiple roles while he was on this earth. Completely sinless, completely perfect in every way. And yet Jesus played multiple roles while he was on this earth. I mentioned this passage last week. This would be another illustration of it. The chapter before Ephesians chapter 5 is Ephesians chapter 4, this is the crack analysis that you get from me. I know, it's really awesome. But in Ephesians 4, it tells us that Jesus is the head of the church. He's taking a leadership role in the church. He's doing and leading the church in the ways that it goes. And so we see Jesus in this leadership role. If we go to Luke 22, verse 42, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane before he goes to be crucified on a cross, to suffer immensely for your sin and my sin so we could be forgiven and right with God. And we see him praying this prayer: Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Jesus is saying in this moment, I don't want to go to the cross. It wouldn't be my preference. It's not my idea. That's not the first thing that I would want to do. But yet you see him submitting to the will of the Father. And so Jesus plays the role of both leader and submitter in his earthly life and ministry. And this is what leads Kathy Keller to say, if submission didn't hurt the second person of the Godhead, it certainly won't hurt me. And that's such a good word for us as people who sometimes can't get it through our heads that it's okay to submit. Not only is it okay, it's actually super healthy. And we're actually forwarding progress in our world, in our communities, and in our marriage when we do so. Now, there's a second word that Paul brings up that's focused in verse 33. He says, respect your husbands. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. At that marriage conference I referred to earlier last Friday and Saturday at our Mount Zion location, Ron and Jody Zappia were the key speakers. And they brought up this acrostic for respect, and it was so good. I was like, okay, we probably need to run that back here this Sunday. And so they actually pointed out that respecting your husband in your marriage has a number of positive benefits, both for your husband and for your marriage and for you. And so I just want to kind of use this acrostic and explain it real briefly. When you respect your husband, number one, you revive him. When you respect your husband and esteem him and display a life-giving wonder toward him, when you appreciate him, you admire him, and you applaud him, you revive him. The E stands for empowers. When wives willingly submit, they help empower their husbands. Look, this was the case for me, by the way. A husband might initially be timid as he's getting started or hesitant as he's getting started in his marriage relationship to lead. But a wife who willingly submits helps her husband rise to the occasion, in part through willingly submitting to her husband. The S stands for strengthens. When you respect your husband, you strengthen your husband. Part of respecting, by the way, is actually bringing your talents, your gifts, and your skills that God has given you to bear in your marriage and in the community. Proverbs 31, which is the great Mother's Day text. So, there's sarcasm in that, but you probably didn't get that, or it wasn't funny enough to laugh at. Either way. But in Proverbs 31, in that text itself, it brings out the idea that here's a wife who is leading well in the community. She's entrepreneurial. She's paying attention and has giftedness in the care of her children and with her hands and the skills that her hands bring to the table. When you bring your leadership that God has given you into the marriage relationship under your husband's leadership, you actually strengthen the marriage and you strengthen him as well. The P stands for praying. When you respect your husband and you pray for him, it's a key to a successful marriage. Ron and Jody Zappia brought this quote, and I thought it was really good. They point out that God accomplishes more through our prayers than he does through our words. God accomplishes more through our prayers than he does through our words. I do think on many occasions that if I can just sit with Colleen, I can convince her to do about anything, right? The same thing with my children. They're 26 and 21. It's getting very difficult because they're really smart. But I'm like, if I can just get a few seconds, I'll be able to convince you that my way is the right way, right? And this is the best thing for us to do and all this kind of stuff. And sometimes the better thing to do in that moment is just pray. Sometimes what happens is God helps them, God just convinces them, and other times he just reveals that, hey, Neal, actually you have a stupid idea, so you should probably go with somebody else. Prayer works far greater than our convincing debating skills. The E stands for encourages. When you respect your husband, you encourage him. Respect puts wind in the sails of your husband. You want your husband to be the best leader that he can possibly be? Encourage him. That will help maximize his efforts. Honest encouragement through respect can have an unbelievable effect on a person. The C is compliments. That's not like I'm complimenting you like, hey, that's a great shirt. But this is like complimenting as in like one fits well with another. Respect fits well in a marriage. That actually happens both sides. But the synergy of a marriage is real. And when a wife respects her husband, she contributes to the synergy of the marriage. And the T stands for transforms. We tend to try to think that the best way to change each other is by applying pressure or force. Not like physical pressure or physical force, but like verbal force, verbal pressure, emotional force, emotional pressure. We tend to think that. But really what helps your husband change the most is when you respect him. God uses that to then change your husband in that transformational Romans 12 way. And so respecting your husband is a key in this process. Now, let me give you 4 takeaways, and we'll be done. 3 things to think about, to challenge your thinking, and then 1 thing to do. Here's the first thing to think about. Trust the Lord to make lasting improvements in your marriage. So, I'm not saying for everyone that struggles with this tension of submitting and respecting, but there may be a few of you that actually you're not really struggling with submitting to your husband the most. You're really struggling to submit to the Lord and his plan. This is that men have the same struggle, just in different ways. People in general struggle with submitting to the Lord. And that may be where this is. If you're like, hey, I'll submit this to the Lord, then you're like, okay, I'll submit to my husband because this is what God's plan is. But let his design for the marriage drive your marriage. And don't let what you think or see in the moment override his guidance. So trust the Lord, first and foremost. 2, think long-term and not short-term in your marriage. Now, we all want quick fixes, okay? And there's probably nothing wrong with the quick fix. If the door handle's loose, if something's squeaky and it needs some repair, okay, there may be a quick fix that will totally work out great. But in a marriage relationship, oftentimes we push hard for quick fixes when what is needed are longer-term solutions. And this is where I think that whole idea of trying to force and pressure your spouse kind of comes into being. Can you force and pressure in this case, your husband to get him to do something one time? Sure, you can do that. And he's probably not going to have too much of an issue one time. If you do it 3 or 4 times, 5 times, it starts to become an issue. And at some point, there's going to be the law of diminishing returns, and eventually he's going to be like, nope, not doing it. Much better to take a long-term solution, to pray consistently and fervently for your husband to make good and wise choices, and to continually make that a pattern of your behavior, and you'll see longer-term solutions come from that as opposed to the simple, I'm going to take matters into my own hands and try to get a quick fix. So think long-term, not short-term. 3, look at the whole picture, not just one specific issue. Look, God's plan for a marriage is comprehensive and all-encompassing. And it might be tempting for you to get stuck on this word submission. I get that. I understand that. I can appreciate that. But the thing is, you're only looking at one small portion of the overall marriage picture. And if God has designed marriage a certain way, it's best when it's lived out the way he has designed. So look at the bigger picture. Lean into what God has for the entire marriage, not just this one specific part. Now here's the one final action piece. And the guys, I feel like maybe I went hard at the guys last week, and I probably did, but it's okay. I told somebody afterwards, part of the reason why I go after guys hard is because I know what it is to be a guy, and I know how we think. And so sometimes we just have to have a little bit of directness. And so here's something I want to encourage the wives to do this morning. I want you to consider committing to only encouraging your husband for the next 30 days. Like for the rest of the month of November, only encouragement. Now, I get it. It can be easy to criticize. It's the fastest, quickest thing out of our mouth to criticize. Yesterday, Jamie and I were watching Penn State and Ohio State. I'm an Ohio State fan. We fired our coach. That was the right choice. We're a train wreck of a team right now. That's also true. I'm totally apathetic toward everything. There's some Ohio State fans in here. God bless you. Yeah, thanks. I'm watching that game yesterday, and I'm completely apathetic. I've gone beyond the point of rooting for my team. I'm no longer rooting for my team. I'm no longer angry at my team. I'm just watching. There's just zero emotion. I could be watching an infomercial and I have the same level of emotion. That's where I am. Jamie, however, is taking a different tack as she's working through this. And she's fired up about every stupid decision that they're making. All right? And I get that. And I can appreciate that. And I am typically very quick to criticize. This is why you come watch. This is why I don't let any of you watch a game with me. I'm not criticizing your team. I'm criticizing my team that I am watching. That's the Philadelphia way. That's what we do. I pointed out several things that the Eagles did wrong in the Super Bowl that they won by like 30, okay? So Jamie's struggling in that moment. I'm struggling. We told you it's easy to criticize. We are first and quick to easily criticize. It takes effort and the work of the Spirit to produce encouragement in the hearts of each one of us. But I'm telling you this, criticizing or encouraging, one of those is going to make a heck of a difference in your marriage, and it's not criticizing. It's as you encourage your husband that you do this. Now, I want to say a couple of things. This does not mean that you cannot disagree with your husband, that you cannot have discussions about different ways and directions of thinking. What I'm simply saying and challenging you to do in this moment is this, that you will refuse to tear down your husband privately and publicly for the month of November, and instead, you will only seek to build him up. And I encourage you, if you do that, your marriage will look significantly different in December than it did right now. And some of you may be already doing this, and this is the culture of who you are. We have some great marriages in this congregation. Some of you are already doing this, and that's great. But I want to encourage the rest of you to rise, set the bar high, and really encourage your husband. You're going to see a huge difference. Well, this week was a fun week for Colleen and I. In 28 years we've been married. It was a good week. It really helped our marriage. Her words and her using the power that God has given her has made a huge impact in our marriage. Wives, you have that power. Use it well for the glory of God and the benefit of your marriage. Let's pray.